I am here today with Jason Ryan, the author of Swamp Kings, which I, have read so many times it's kind of embarrassing. He's also the author of one of my other favorite books, which is Jackpot, which I have also read a number of times just because, as a researcher, I appreciate all the detail you go into in telling these stories historically. The first thing I wanted to talk about is the title of the book. I mean, it's a perfect description of the Murdaugh dynasty leading up to Alex Murdaugh's epic fall. Did you have the title in mind when you started writing the book?
No, it took a little while. I'm not sure exactly when it happened. I have to give credit to my wife, Elizabeth, for helping coin the name. But exactly, once those words were uttered, both of us were in agreement that this was the title because, the importance of the swamp, it's a place where the Murdaughs could only exist the way they have. And, these generations of that have held power in Hampton County and the surrounding counties. And, they were the kings and that they had, truly they had other titles over the years of solicitors, the only one. But truly it was a king-like power and that they, there were jokes made by the Attorney General of South Carolina, even that's Buster's territory, talking about Alex Murdaugh's grandfather. And so, I just felt like the way they, Buster, especially the older Buster, ruled without any challenge to his power. He was elected, I think, 12 times, and only once or twice had any kind of opposition, and even then it was minimal. So it just there seemed to be no end to their reign as a family, and so that's exactly. I thought the title there was no second runner-up title. There was no. Can't even recall what I may have called it, as a working title, but Swamp Kings easily supplanted that.
Yeah, I saw it and I was like, oh, that is the title. Like I was really excited when I saw the title and the cover of the book.
It's catchy. The cover too, exactly. It seems to have Alex Murdaugh rising out of the swamp, the cypress swamp, and almost like an alligator would. And, of course, I use that metaphor, the swamp creatures, to stand in for Alex and his grandfather, especially either the alligator or the cottonmouth, right? These predators, very vicious creatures, ones you don't want to corner.
And, speaking of like the imagery on the title of the book, what struck me early on while reading Swamp Kings was your rich and vivid descriptions of the landscape of the Lowcountry. I mean, I don't think it's easy to understand the beauty of the area. And I don't think people have had the opportunity, all people really see in the news is, the drive-by shots of Moselle, but, behind Moselle is the Salcahatchee Swamp. And, these swamps are such a part of the culture. Your descriptions of the landscape of the area reminded me of Pat Conroy. That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Poetic. And you live in the Lowcountry. This is your home.
Well, certainly, and I hope I did it justice, and by your account, I did, and that's gratifying to hear. But certainly, I've been enchanted by, we talked about the landscape, and there are a couple, of course. There's the coastal landscape, the marshes, and then as you move inland and encounter more fresh water, it becomes swampy. And so there are, of course, lots of creatures that move between, and it's a gradual transition. And then you referenced my first book, Jackpot, about marijuana smugglers, and these are sailors who used the coast and came in the creeks and inlets to smuggle marijuana. In this story, it's not that far away geographically, but just a few miles inland, and it's a totally different kind of environment in terms of this dark. If the marshes are sunny, a lot of times there's few trees. In the swamp, there's lots of trees. It's a heavy canopy. It's shady in a lot of places and dark. And ironically, in the winter, of course, a lot of the canopy lessens and more light is allowed in. But it's somewhere that just by me traveling into Hampton to do my reporting over and over, I just went by and witnessed the change from the coast, my home in Charleston, to the inland Lowcountry areas, and going through two different swamps on my route. I went past a lot of farms. As I left Charleston and left suburbia, downtown Charleston and then suburbia, it just really got into the country. And I talk about there being two different worlds, and almost like when you go through one of those swamps, it's almost like a time machine too, and you're going to a different place, and there's almost no overlap. The swamps act as this barrier and have isolated Hampton for better and worse for a long time.
Right, right. And there's, I mean, the 14th Judicial Circuit, which is what the Murdaughs reigned over for so many years, it encompasses 5 counties, I think. Is it 5 or 6? I think 5.
I think it's the largest, if not by
Yeah.
area, it's the only one with 5
And
counties.
yeah, and you know, when you start in Beaufort, which is one of the counties, and drive up into Hampton and Colleton and Jasper, you see the like, as you're driving, you see the landscape change, and you see it's very interesting how, you know, Beaufort, which is a very wealthy and, you know, beachside community, and you go into Hampton and it's very different. Not in a bad way. You know, I love the downtown area of Hampton, the little shops down there, the people there, but it's just such a, you know, dichotomy. Like, it just always has struck me. And I think you did a really good job, you know, incorporating all of these judicial circuits into your narrative.
Well, it's challenging for anyone not from the area to appreciate the difference between Jasper County and Allendale County and Hampton and Estill
Right.
and Yemassee, blah, blah, blah. And so I do think, so there's a street sweeping machine going by my house for a second.
So, as a researcher, I mean, the research that you conducted for this book was extensive. I have been, you know, I've been all over these files. I've been all over these historical archives, talking to locals, and I still, while I was reading your book, my jaw dropped at some of the stories. And I don't want to give any of it away, but, you know, in terms of the research that you did, how long did it take you to write?
Well, it was, you know, I guess from start to finish, about 2.5 years, more or less, to do everything. I reported up until basically the very end. I was still chasing a few things that, you know, I put what I could in the book, but I didn't get to the bottom to, or couldn't verify ultimately,
Right.
especially concerning the murder and just some more of the more contemporary crimes. But so I, you know, that, and it was just written in a rush. So basically post-trial, almost all of it was written in a span of like 6 months. And I went over my word count. So I had a lot to say, and I was surprised at how much, you know, once you start writing, how much you actually have.
Yeah.
And, you know, so it was just a blitz to get it finished at the end. And, you know, I think that can be forgotten too, because, but, you know, even though it just came out, I'd stopped writing. I basically turned in the last part on Halloween or so. And it was just, that's, you know, only 8 months or so, or whatever, 9 months after the trial ended, 6 months. I can't even do the math. So it was all fast. But it was, you know, I was compelled to do it. It was so interesting. And there was such a media frenzy about it all that you couldn't help get caught up in it. And it felt, you know, that was my life for a little while.
Yeah. It's hard to describe how.
Yeah,
how
I'll
your
say just in
brain,
terms
your
of
brain
the
just,
research.
like, it takes over your brain.
Oh, certainly. And there were a lot of, you know, the trial took to be there in person, which I was, took a lot of time, almost 5 or 6 weeks. There were other hearings. I spent a lot of time in the archives, as you referenced. I go up to Columbia, to the state Supreme Court, and look through old cases. I went to Hampton County, all the counties in the, you know, the 14th Circuit. Other counties, I remember having to go to St. Matthews to look for files, and I did interviews up in Asheville area, Waynesville, North Carolina, in the upstate and Midlands, you know, really everywhere, a lot down in the Lowcountry, of course. And so, you know, between the people, the archives, and just the court hearings and trials, there was a lot to explore. And I ran out of time. I think anyone who's, you know, every book writer ran out of time. There was more I could do. But on the other hand, too, I think I got most of it. I don't, you know, maybe a few things I could elaborate on or even solve or something like that. But for the most part, I accomplished what I set out to do. It was just a rush timeline.
What I appreciate about the book is that, you know, well, what the murders of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh and the trial is what drew the captivated the world. What I loved about your book is that while it was a part of the book, it was a part of the book. It wasn't the whole narrative. And I think it's important to look at, you know, the generational corruption, because it really does, it made what happened currently very possible. And you did that, and you did it in a way where you weaved together, the crimes and the stories and the corruption of the past with what we were seeing currently. And somebody told me one time that the Hampton County history could be an anthropological study in generational corruption. And that stuck with me. And I feel like this book is kind of that. So I do really appreciate how, were you struck? Was that your plan early on, or as you were researching, were you struck by the parallels?
Exactly, unfolded kind of gradually. I thought
Right.
there was something there. I thought that was my unique contribution, could be a real deep dive into the history. I knew other media organizations, reporters, authors were scratching the surface, but few were putting in the time in certain archives like I was. And so I just saw that as other people were publishing sooner or on a daily basis, like y'all, or newspapers. And so I needed to bring something to the table. And so that was going to be my angle. And then, yes, as I started researching and hearing the stories about Alex's grandfather, Buster Murdaugh, I started seeing these parallels and realizing this has all happened before, like literally these same crimes, the stealing. There's an alleged murder plot involving Buster Murdaugh's mistress, the elder Buster Murdaugh, blah, blah, blah. The trafficking, if Alex trafficked, opioids and drugs, illicit drugs. His grandfather did the same with whiskey and with babies, even at some point, that were, birthed by prostitutes in a brothel. So you have, it was striking, exactly. And I thought, as a presentation, to do this story linearly, it would take a long time to get to Alex Murdaugh, right? He's the end of 4 generations, basically, and that I profile. And then also what would be lost is the way these parallels, I thought you could almost stack them on top of each other in a way in the book. It doesn't align perfectly, maybe, but you see Alex's behavior, you see his grandfather's, you see Alex, you see his grandfather's over and over, and they're not the same person, but almost very
Right.
similar. It's
Right.
almost, Alec learned very well at grandfather's knee. It makes you wonder if he was even explicit about, here's how you do it, or if it's just passed down naturally and it's something instinctual in them. I don't know. I make that comparison with the instinctual, the instincts of a reptile are maybe not that different. They're just, they see prey and they react. And it's amazing how quickly, I compare an alligator. I've watched them hunt here in the Lowcountry, and it's amazing. They seem so lazy and still, and then all of a sudden they're in action like that and just grabbing, their quarry.
Yeah, as that is like it was it was the perfect analogy for me. And it just, they, even despite all of the crime and corruption for years, I think people knew that. It wasn't unknown to people what was happening, but yet they still respected the family and, the Randolphs.
Well, right. And, on the flip side, the men who served as prosecutor did put a number of criminals behind bars, or sent them to the electric chair, which some people felt was appropriate for the crimes committed. They did favors and, just exercise the discretion of a solicitor, which cases need to go to trial, which ones could be dealt in other ways. But of course, there were, lots of examples of abuse too. And that's the rub, right? Like, they wanted it both ways, and to dole out favors all the time. Buster certainly, and his son Randolph III to a lesser extent, but it was a big favor system there, and that's why people liked them, because they got breaks and favors, and the solicitors let things go. And is that a reason to like someone? Like, it made this corrupt brew down there that
Right.
was never cleaned up.
Right. And it's hard. I've tried to explain this to people, because they're like, well, I can't believe that person, was peripherally involved in that. And I'm like, you have to understand the position that these people are in. And I think I saw like a lot of instances where a favor was done and the person didn't realize the weight of that favor. They didn't realize, that once they do something slightly illegal, they've got something to hold over them. And I saw that over and over again in my research, where it just, you could kind of see that trend happening. And I had a lot of empathy for people that had been pulled into that ring by, by the people in charge.
Well, exactly. I mean, I sympathize too in that it's not easy to stand up to someone who is pulling all the strings and holds all the cards, and that's what they were up against with Buster Murdaugh. Certainly, that 46 years as solicitor, he just ruled that area, had this long reign, and it was the few people who did fight him. I talked briefly about this lawyer named Bob Warren in Allendale who couldn't pay his light bills at the office, represented very poor defendants, and the few times he annoyed Buster, he paid dearly for it, and his clients paid dearly for it, and other people saw that example and knew not to do the same thing. Spare yourself the misery. It's I compared him to Don Quixote tilting at windmills, and that it was a hopeless battle to take on Buster Murdaugh. It's just like going into the swamp to wrestle with an alligator. Like, you got to be someone to pull that off.
Right.
And no one emerged, or no one cared. Let Buster have Hampton.
Right. Whatever. Yeah. And I think you and I both, after Operation Jackpot and, Dick Harpootlian saying that this is so much bigger than the murders of Paul and Maggie, that it's like Ozarks, I think you and I both have dug into that potential drug trafficking angle. I've hit a lot of roadback blocks. I have not given up, but did you see parallels to your first book, Operation Jackpot and Swamp Kings, at all?
Well, I mean, it's a broad comparison to make, I suppose. And well, yes, and that both stories feature an environment that's manipulated to enable wrongdoing, and it's just the seclusion afforded by all the creeks and inlets let the smugglers bring in pot without anyone noticing, essentially. And then the swampy environment just kept Hampton fairly isolated, and just there wasn't the intrusion of modernity or oversight. It was just kind of a backwoods, backwater, whatever you want to call it. And that just enabled corruption to thrive. And so in that way, the landscape is integral to these stories, the similar shared landscape. On the other hand, people wonder about some massive drug smuggling ring. I talked to some DEA sources. They had nothing on that.
Yeah.
I don't think Alec has the temperament, a very different temperament than the guys I interviewed in Jackpot. They were wild and crazy and loose, but they were also cerebral to some extent, and like they had a plan and had things organized and knew when to be discreet, patient, right, and disciplined in some ways. Not very disciplined in others, and that's why they were fun. But with Alec, I didn't see his schemes to me were very simple. It's simply like he took in so much money and just gave less out, if any.
Right.
And also the financial distress he appeared to be in. People are now supposedly looking for the feds, Mark Tinsley looking for missing money. But if he had money accessible, I think he would have used it to keep the accountant off his back from the law firm, or satisfy the other debts he owed his friend Chris Wilson, et cetera. If the whole theory is, at least from the prosecution standpoint, that he murdered to escape these financial troubles he was in, well, if there were millions sitting somewhere easy to access, like, he would have grabbed it, and because he did in other ways. He wouldn't have borrowed from the law firm partners then if there was easier way to get the money, and he was in a pinch. So I just don't think he was some kind of cartel leader, and that. On the other hand, I'm intrigued by this airstrip that was at Moselle. The criminal history of Barrett Bull, where he was friends with, their land transactions and real estate deals they pursued together. I'm not dismissing it or promising that I have all the answers, but practically speaking, what were they smuggling to? Was it pot, opioids, cocaine? There's no answers for that. Everything. I mean, I've heard a lot of human trafficking. I've heard of Haitians coming in, and you're like, well, which Haitians are typically Haitian immigrants are poor and desperate, and so there's no money to be made there unless I'm missing something. You've heard every rumor under the sun, like I have. The sex trafficking rings, I don't know. There's at the end of the day, there's not evidence of those things.
Yeah,
I think
I
not
haven't
sufficient
been able.
evidence.
Yeah, I haven't been able to, pull anything sufficiently enough to source something enough to roll with it yet. But I do still listen to the stories. And the airstrip and the transfer of the Moselle property always intrigued me. It just seemed seemed like could have made things possible, but can I prove it? No.
I heard from the beginning, that there were planes swooping low or landing at the airport within Hampton and Farmville, among houses, which would seem very bold. And now all these other shenanigans happening at the airport there. And, but again, the shady past of different operators of people there. And, I went down so many different rabbit holes, and some I, yielded something. A lot I couldn't rule it out, but I also couldn't say, yes, that happened.
Do you think any of this would have come to light if Paul and Maggie Murdaugh hadn't been murdered?
That's I think it's kind of like Alex Gamble to testify in his own defense. It was a desperate measure, and that going in, but maybe that's all you got. He certainly, I don't know that we know the full story or what maybe they were going to reveal, or I wonder too just about the role of the drug addiction and just even that night with withdrawal, and if that some kind of in a moment of anger, a spasm of anger that Alec did what he did. I think it was too desperate. Maybe if he just sat it out, it was like too much of an overcorrection, so to speak, for too severe. But maybe all the cards were collapsing anyway. But that's a shame. It's such a desperate ploy with such a little chance for success, but at such high cost. The loss of two people, the murder of them, and family members nonetheless. So I don't know. Hindsight's always 20. We know that way didn't work. So we're going to say, yeah, maybe you shouldn't have. Just any case, you shouldn't kill people really, unless they're going to kill you perhaps. But I don't know. He just, what was his mental state? Was he spooked by what happened earlier that day at the law firm being confronted? There's this theory, though, that it was somewhat planned, whether, in his mind to take place at some future date. And then this had to be the moment. There's some element where I just don't know how it was all covered up so quickly, too. If, the distances involved between Almeida and Moselle and other possible areas of intrigue, it's just, there's a lot happening at once, supposedly somewhat spontaneously.
Yeah. It was, I think somebody described it like a total cluster bleep for all that happened at once. It was
indeed almost to, have been pulled off, and just the whole, scenario with the Snapchat video was amazing. And that's, at the end of the day, the case of the state's case, hung on that, narrowly, right?
Right. Yeah, it always surprised me that was found so late in the investigation.
Right. So, almost not at all. Right. Or,
I think they would have found it eventually, but, I think people were ready for an indictment, and that came at just the right time so that they could do that indictment.
I feel like we haven't gotten a straight answer. And, the statement that came out right after the murders about there's, no need to worry, or I forgot the exact wording, but, they've never come clean to say the police, the police and the Attorney General's office to say, the Attorney General's office wasn't involved at the time, but the police to say either local or SLED that, why they had that suspicion of Alec, or that they had, that he was the suspect, or, was it just simply it's a domestic, and, chances are the loved one, statistically, they would say that they don't. And so that's still kind of perplexing to me is what was going on at the very beginning.
Right. In terms of the investigation. So when you closed the book out, you described, you're talking about Judge Newman and, his role in this, but the last sentence talks about Hampton and a cleansing rain. And it was beautiful, because that is exactly what they need. They just need, the corruption to stop. They need it to they'd start over. It is I've met some of my favorite people are from Hampton. I've got some extremely close friends now. And they're wonderful people. And they want the corruption out of their county. They're still fighting it. Do you think that there's hope to kind of push that corruption out, to root out what's been going underneath the system?
I do. I think, hope springs eternal. Is it Dum spiro sparrows, as I breathe, I hope, is our state motto in South Carolina. I probably butchered the pronunciation of the Latin, but you get my drift. And I've met wonderful people down there too, including a number who were brave enough to put their name out there for me to put in the book. And yes, they told stories of what happens when there's no oversight and no one standing up and saying that's wrong and it's not going to be tolerated. And I think there's a number of financial problems there on the county level and the government. And I think in a way, maybe that's good. Finally, some citizens will step up who are honest and capable, and that they can right the ship. Hampton does have a lot of positive attributes, and certainly, as I wrote about the landscape, the history, the culture, some of the other characters from the town. That's what I tried to highlight too. That it's not entirely negative. And even within the Murdaugh family, there have been actions that have been positive. They're, fairly progressive actions taken in the civil rights era. Not always, but at times. And so I tried to give credit where credit was due. So I do think there's hope. I talk about this rain. I was just, again, it brought it back to the swamps, the way the swamps are formed by the rainfall and, needing to sweep out the decay and make it better, cleaner, thin the canopy. All those kind of metaphors are appropriate. There are a lot of great people there that I think can do better. And maybe I've tried to lay it all out there. It's not always pretty. Some parts are painful, hard to read, and the things that have happened. But I thought by not saying it completely, that people might not get the full picture, and it's important to get that so we can make some changes, and that all of us in other parts of the state can expect better, not just in Hampton, wherever we are. This isn't unique to Hampton County or the 14th Circuit. This kind of corruption does exist in a lot of places in the state, and anywhere where people turn their head or stick it in the sand. So it just happened a little more often down in Hampton recently, I suppose, or over the last century.
Right. So this is kind of as a fan of your writing, what's next for you?
Oh, well, thanks. I'm glad you're excited. I had been working on a shipwreck book out in the Pacific, so as far away as Hampton County in the Lowcountry as possible. It's a nice mental cleanse. And so I've been going there recently. It's a little out near Midway Island, the shipwreck occurred. And I'm just writing about, it's a Navy boat. And it's just kind of a story of heroism, sacrifice, and it's no living witnesses. So no one's going to hang up the phone on me this time. It's and it's a lonely journey too, because you just only go through the archives. The company you keep is the sailors who are long dead, who you're reading their journals and letters home and stuff like that. So it's just a story. Every book I write, I think I live vicariously through the characters in some ways. With Swamp Kings, maybe a little less. That's just kind of like something that was in my backyard that hard to ignore. Like if I am a journalist and writer, like how can I not weigh in on this one that's unfolding within arm's reach or something, 2-hour drive down to Hampton. So yeah, I'm into this shipwreck story, and it's and just shipwrecks in general, and they all kind of boil down to the same situation. You're on your own, no one knows you're even there. Like, what are you gonna do?
Grab a life vest.
Save yourself. And I like that. And you see some of the behaviors, just like talking about parallels and Swamp Kings. Some of the behaviors among shipwreck castaways are the same too, no matter if they're in the North Pacific or Antarctica or wherever it is. There's similar methods and behaviors, and so that's kind of interesting to me.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to read it. I am, like I said, I have, when I get your books, I read them quickly, and then I like to go back and read them again, and I like to, get the details and absorb them. So I do typically read your books at least twice, sometimes and usually more. So I'm excited to read the next one.
That's always good to hear. Yeah, I suppose they're dense. I do think I try to structure them where also this back and forth structure allowed for a lot of suspense. You can end it on a scene where you need to go through the history before you get back to the present and vice versa. So I do try to make it page turning to the extent possible, but it's also, I will say, like I work on it for 2, 3, 4 years, some of these books, and then people read them in that many days and or less.
Like,
it's good. It's good. I'd rather hear that than I didn't finish it. It's better to hear I couldn't put it down, but it also, it is funny to see years worth of work reduced to that quick a consumption.
I like when I like something, I tend to read really fast, really quickly. But when I really like something, I like to go back through because I know how quickly I read. So I like to I like to go back and like get the details. So yeah, I think this is one of those books. If you're reading it, take your time, because I think it's an important tale to tell.
Were you struck by, I mean, going back, I don't know, too, I tried to place things so they're always, the reader can appreciate them, but sometimes maybe you appreciate more if it did take a second tour through it. Some of these newspaper columns that reference crime coming to town, or the leading light of the famous family, shooting his family member, things that were like eerily specific to what eventually happened out at Moselle. I thought those were really striking, and maybe, yeah, I don't know if they're always appreciated right away, but I tried to put them in there. Just, I was really struck by finding those. And also this novel that was supposedly undertaken by the editor of the Hampton County Guardian. And
yes,
I thought for sure he was referring to Buster Murdaugh, but who knows?
Yeah. I mean, all of that, because I mean, when I need downtime, I go into archives and look at old stories. It's kind of just what I like to do to give my brain a break. And that's I loved that you had so many of those narratives that I'd been reading for years in the story, and then weaved in with the current story. I'm a huge fan of this book.
Hampton just changed so much. It went from nothing, a place in the swamps, right, to the town it is today in a century. And so that was, fun for me to kind of chronicle, and the importance of the train station and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. The train, I mean, the importance of the trains in general in Hampton. I mean, it is right down the center of the county, and it's played such a vital role in everything that's happened. I mean,
yeah, I remember, the first time I went to Hampton, it was, 20 years ago. I was at the Beaufort Gazette as a young reporter. And so I had made just a trip. I went through Yemassee and just said, keep going, like Sunday drive sort of thing. I had a little convertible at the time, and an MGB. And I was struck by, once you went through, I think, got past Yemassee, you go through Varnville, and then Hampton, and then up through, I guess, Brunson next, and onto Allendale. And each of the towns, the rails went right through the middle of town, inconveniently, right? And
right.
They built on both sides, where you might think you would build on one side or the other, so you didn't have to keep crossing the tracks, but that's not how it unfolded.
You have to go right over the tracks to get into any, downtown area. It's an interesting setup, and I think they maximize that with the law firm, the house that CSX built.
Sure. Right. And I was just, now I understand why it was that way, but I was wondering, why would you have each of these little settlements? Like Brunson is so small, why wouldn't it just be part of Hampton or Allendale? Like, why, but of course now I see that maybe there was a little sawmill there, or there's some reason to make a stop there and make a settlement, and, just closer to that part of the forest, and where we can log more cypress or whatever.
Yeah. It's definitely a really interesting area. And I think, if you can't visit Hampton, understanding the landscape is really important to understanding what happened, over the century. So that's, I mean, I can't say enough about your book. I really loved it.
Thank you. That's so kind of you.
Well, thank you so much for talking to me. Like I said, I'm a huge fan, so I was really excited to.
Well, the same. I certainly, I counted on a lot of journalists to do. I used Fitsnews' reporting and many other journalists too to inform my story. I didn't get everything myself, so I have to give credit to all my peers, and that includes you too. So thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, have a wonderful weekend. This probably come out next week, so but you have a wonderful weekend.
Well, great. Same to you. Awesome.
All right.
Thanks for chatting.
All right.
See ya.